Chapter 1, The Impossible Task. The air inside the Galactic Institute of Multiversal Knowledge, GIMK, lecture hall thrummed with the low hum of alien voices. Ethereal screens floated in midair, displaying complex equations that shimmered with shifting symbols. Some looked like fractals, others like twisting strands of light. Ethan Caldwell, the lone human in the class, leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, eyes scanning the problem with quiet curiosity. At the front of the room, Professor Zilvar, a towering Xerthian, exuded the same quiet arrogance he always carried when addressing the lesser minds of the galaxy. His deep purple exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial lighting, and his three clawed hands folded behind his back as his voice reverberated through the hall. "This," he declared, motioning toward the holographic problem, "is a fundamental exercise in transdimensional calculus. It has taken even my most gifted students days to solve. You have 1 week." A murmur rippled through the class. Ethan could already hear some of his peers, members of species whose brains operated on multiple planes of existence, grumbling about the challenge ahead. The problem itself looked daunting at first glance. Layers upon layers of variables folded into non-Euclidean structures, weaving into a seemingly impenetrable knot of logic. Zilvar's gaze swept over the students before landing on Ethan with thinly veiled contempt. "I do not expect all of you to complete it," he added, his mandibles clicking with amusement. Ethan arched a brow, suppressing a smirk. The professor wasn't subtle. Ever since humans were admitted to GIMK, Zilvar had been looking for ways to prove that they were little more than cosmic anomalies, curious, but fundamentally inferior. The assignment appeared complicated, but Ethan had spent years dealing with systems that looked impossible on paper. The trick was simple: find the pattern, break it down, and look for the shortcut that others missed. He cracked his knuckles and pulled up his personal interface, fingers flying across the surface as he worked through the logic. The rest of the class was still deciphering the first layer of equations when Ethan saw it, an inherent redundancy buried within the problem, a fundamental flaw that rendered all the complexity meaningless. A grin tugged at his lips. They'd been overthinking it. With a few quick calculations, he bypassed the unnecessary variables, streamlined the solution, and tapped the submit key. A soft chime echoed. "Done," Ethan said casually. Silence. Heads turned. Even the students who had multiple sets of eyes blinked in disbelief. Professor Zilvar stiffened. "What did you say?" "I'm done," Ethan repeated, folding his arms behind his head. Wasn't that the assignment? For a long moment, no one moved. Zilvar strode over to Ethan's console, towering over him as his 6 iridescent eyes flickered across the screen. A second later, the professor's exoskeleton twitched, a Xerthian's equivalent of a flinch. His mandibles clicked once, twice, before his gaze snapped back to Ethan. "This is impossible," Zilvar growled. "You must have used external assistance." Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender. "Check the logs. No outside help. Just me, a brain, and a little lateral thinking." The professor's claws tapped the console, pulling up the system records. His expression darkened as the data confirmed Ethan's claim: no unauthorized tools, no AI interference, no computational shortcuts beyond what was available to everyone else. By now, the rest of the class had abandoned their own work, watching the exchange with wide eyes. A few murmured among themselves, others simply stared, waiting for Zilvar's next move. The professor's posture stiffened. His pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge Ethan's success so easily. "This is a trick," Zilvar spat. "A statistical anomaly. You could not have understood the problem so quickly." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I get that this is a blow to your ego, but it wasn't that hard. The equations were bloated with redundant variables. Once I recognized the pattern, I just cut the fluff. Efficient problem solving, one of humanity's specialties." A sharp hiss left Zilvar's mandibles. "You think you are superior?" "Not superior. Just efficient," Ethan replied, shrugging. "We don't always brute force problems. We think sideways." The tension in the room was palpable. Zilvar's claws flexed, his pride warring with reason. Ethan knew exactly what was happening. The professor couldn't outright fail him without justification, but admitting a human had bested his challenge was equally unthinkable. Finally, Zilvar straightened, his posture regaining its rigid authority. "If you are as capable as you claim," he said slowly, "then you will have no objections to a second test. A real challenge, one that no student has ever solved in less than a month." Ethan let out a small chuckle. "Oh, so now we're moving the goalposts?" "Consider it an opportunity," the professor sneered. "If you succeed, then you will have proven that humanity is not merely lucky, but truly worthy of this institution." The murmurs around the room grew louder. Some students eyed Ethan with newfound respect, others with resentment. He was making waves, whether he wanted to or not. Ethan exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Fine," he said, standing up. "Bring it on." Zilvar's mandibles curled into something resembling a predatory grin. "Very well," he said, turning toward the main console. "Let us see how far human ingenuity truly goes." Chapter 2, Proving the Impossible. Ethan stood before the Galactic Institute of Multiversal Knowledge's academic board, arms crossed, jaw tight. The massive chamber hummed with a dozen alien languages as scholars from across the galaxy whispered among themselves. Towering holographic displays filled the air, each one detailing Ethan's supposed offense. At the center of it all stood Professor Zilvar, rigid and triumphant. "This human," Zilvar declared, his mandibles clicking, "has defied all known logic. Either he possesses knowledge beyond what his species should be capable of, or he has cheated." Ethan exhaled through his nose. "I didn't cheat." Across the room, a variety scholar, a translucent skinned being with a floating, neural lattice instead of a head, hovered closer. "Then how do you explain solving a 7-day problem in mere minutes?" Ethan shrugged. "You're all looking at the problem wrong." Murmurs spread like wildfire. The idea that the board, composed of some of the galaxy's most brilliant minds, could have overlooked something was unthinkable. Zilvar took a step forward, his 3 arms folding behind his back. "A convenient excuse," he sneered. "But excuses do not belong in academia. If you truly wish to defend your so-called human ingenuity, you will accept a second challenge." Ethan met his gaze. He wasn't about to back down. "Name it." A slow, predatory grin spread across Zilvar's face. With a wave of his clawed hand, the central holographic display flickered, revealing a sprawling equation. It stretched across dimensions, numbers folding into themselves, shifting in real time like a living entity. "This," Zilvar announced, "is the 4th-dimensional energy collapse paradox. It has baffled scholars for over a century. No one, not one being, has solved it in less than a month." He leaned in slightly. "If you are as capable as you claim, solve it now." Silence gripped the room. Every gaze was locked onto Ethan. Some held doubt, others curiosity. A few carried the glint of anticipation, secretly hoping he would prove Zilvar wrong. Ethan inhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "All right," he said, stepping toward the floating equation. "Let's see what we're working with." Breaking the code. Ethan analyzed the projection, his mind slicing through layers of complexity. At first glance, the equation was a nightmare, shifting variables, recursive functions, entire sections looping back into paradoxes. Most beings would approach it by brute force, running simulations or attempting to untangle it step by step. But Ethan wasn't most beings. He leaned in, studying the deeper patterns. The problem wasn't just a math equation, it was a trick. A test of perception. His fingers flew over the holographic interface, isolating key components, stripping away unnecessary clutter. The paradox wasn't real. It was a self-referential feedback loop that only appeared unsolvable because of the way it was presented. He exhaled through his nose. "Clever," he muttered. "But not clever enough." With swift precision, he restructured the equation, bypassing the paradox entirely. A few keystrokes later, he hit submit. The room held its breath. A chime echoed through the chamber. the equation vanished, replaced by a single glowing symbol. Solution verified. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, gasps. Mutters. Someone dropped their datapad. Zilvar's exoskeleton stiffened, his eyes flickering rapidly between the screen and Ethan. "No," he breathed. "That is not possible." Ethan smirked. "Didn't say it was easy. Just said it wasn't impossible." The board members exchanged glances. Some looked stunned, others suspicious. A Zelthari elder, a being composed of shifting crystal shards, tilted its head. "Explain your method," it said, voice resonating like wind through chimes. Ethan nodded. "You are all trying to solve it linearly. But this equation isn't actually a paradox, it's an illusion of one. The feedback loops were designed to trap the solver into thinking they had to account for every variable. In reality, you only needed to isolate the core function and bypass the recursive elements entirely." More whispers. A few members of the board began reviewing his calculations in real time, their expressions shifting from doubt to reluctant admiration. One of them, a cybernetic being from the Rixon Collective, spoke up. "He's right. The solution is valid." Zilvar twitched. His entire posture screamed protest, but he had no argument left. Ethan had done what he claimed. And more importantly, he had done it in front of witnesses. The professor's mandibles flexed, voice cold. "You, humans. Always seeking to break rules rather than follow them." Ethan gave a casual shrug. "We don't break rules. We just don't let them box us in." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a blade. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the Varadi scholar let out a strange, warbling chuckle. "Fascinating," it mused. "Perhaps we have underestimated humanity after all." The board exchanged nods. The Zelthari elder turned toward Ethan. "You have demonstrated an unconventional but undeniably effective approach to problem solving." It inclined its head slightly. "The board will review this matter. But as of now, your position at the Institute remains intact." Ethan released a slow breath. He had one. But Zilvar wasn't done. The professor straightened, a forced air of neutrality masking his frustration. "Very well. You have proven something." His eyes glinted. "But knowledge is not merely solving equations in controlled environments. The true test of intellect is application." Ethan frowned. "What are you getting at?" Zilvar's mandibles curled. "If you are so confident in human ingenuity, then I propose a final test. A real-world challenge, one that cannot be solved from behind a console." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Define real-world challenge." The professor turned toward the board. "I request that the human be sent on a field examination, a live research mission. If he truly deserves a place at GIMK, let him prove it under real pressure." Murmurs swept through the chamber. It was an unusual request, but not unprecedented. And worse, it was something Ethan couldn't solve in minutes. The Zelthari elder considered. Then, slowly, it nodded. "Accepted." Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to back down. "Fine," he said. "Where are we going?" Zilvar's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "A small, unstable planetoid on the outer rim of the VRYX expanse. It is home to an anomaly, one that no researcher has yet fully understood." He tilted his head. "If you can decipher that, then perhaps humanity does deserve its place here." Ethan exhaled. This was going to be dangerous. But he wasn't about to let Zilvar win. Challenge accepted. Chapter 3, Into the Unknown. The VRYX expanse loomed ahead, a vast, turbulent region of space riddled with anomalies. Ethan stood at the helm of the GIMK research vessel, arms crossed, gaze locked onto the swirling storm of distorted light beyond the viewport. The planetoid, officially designated XR-47, floated at the heart of the chaos, its surface cracked with glowing fissures pulsing with unstable energy. Behind him, a cold voice cut through the hum of the ship. "You may still turn back," Professor Zilvar said, standing rigid near the control panel. His exoskeleton gleamed under the dim lighting, his tone laced with poorly concealed satisfaction. "There's no shame in recognizing one's limits." Ethan smirked. "Nice try." Zilvar's mandibles twitched. He had clearly hoped the human would balk at the challenge. Instead, Ethan was already suiting up. The research team consisted of Ethan, a Varadi scientist named Dr. Velrax, and an Athari field technician called Jorik, a six-limbed, insectoid alien with an impressive track record in hazardous environments. Unlike Zilvar, neither of them seemed particularly invested in seeing Ethan fail. Dr. Velrax floated closer, his translucent neural lattice pulsing with soft light. "Sensors indicate extreme gravitational fluctuations," he said. "Be advised, standard physics may not apply once we're on the surface." "Fantastic," Ethan muttered, fastening the last clasp on his reinforced exosuit. "Anything else I should know before we jump into this death trap?" Jorik chittered, his mandibles clicking. "Yes. If the planet tries to kill you, do not take it personally." Ethan let out a dry chuckle, then stepped into the drop pod. The others followed. Moments later, the airlock hissed shut, and the countdown began. Descent into chaos. The pod plunged toward XR-47, rattling violently as gravitational eddies yanked it in different directions. Ethan gritted his teeth, gripping the armrest as the atmosphere turned into a storm of crackling energy. For a brief moment, the entire pod twisted, not physically, but spatially, as if reality itself had flexed. Then, with a bone-jarring impact, they hit the ground. "Status?" Ethan asked, already unstrapping himself. Jorik checked his scanner. "Hull integrity, stable. Gravity, erratic. I recommend walking in a straight line very carefully." Dr. Velrax hovered toward the hatch, pressing a control pad. The door slid open, revealing the alien landscape beyond. The ground was black stone, cracked and pulsing with eerie, bioluminescent veins of shifting color. Jagged spires of obsidian jutted from the terrain, and in the distance, the air itself seemed to fracture, brief rifts appearing and disappearing in flashes of distorted light. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, feeling his weight shift unpredictably with each step. The gravity wasn't just strong or weak, it was inconsistent. One moment, he felt as heavy as lead, the next, he nearly floated off the surface before being yanked down again. Jorik grumbled. "I hate planets that do this." Dr. Velrax activated his scanner. "The anomaly's core is approximately 3 kilometers ahead. We must proceed, carefully." Zilvar's voice crackled through their comms. "Impress me, human. If you can." Ethan rolled his eyes and tapped his helmet mic. "Still watching? Thought you'd be too busy polishing your exoskeleton." A hiss of irritation came through before Zilvar cut the channel. Ethan smirked. "Let's move." Facing the anomaly. They trekked across the unstable terrain, dodging sudden shifts in gravity and unpredictable spatial distortions. At one point, Jorik reached out to grab a nearby rock, only for his entire arm to phase through it as if it weren't real. "That's unsettling," he muttered, pulling his hand back. Dr. Velrax's neural lattice pulsed rapidly. "Reality is unstable here. Be mindful of what you touch." As they neared their destination, a massive structure came into view. It wasn't natural. Towering at the heart of the anomaly was an alien construct, ancient and pulsing with energy. It looked partially collapsed, massive stone pillars leaning at impossible angles, with glowing, shifting symbols along its surface. At its center, a swirling rift floated in midair, distorting everything around it. Ethan felt his skin prickle. "This wasn't in the mission briefing," he muttered. Dr. Velrax sounded almost reverent. "This predates recorded history. We may be standing before an artifact of a long-lost civilization." Jorik snorted. "Or a trap." Ethan approached the rift cautiously. His suit's sensors flickered wildly, struggling to process the data. He pulled up his personal scanner, running an analysis. The results made his stomach drop. "This thing isn't just warping space," he said. "It's rewriting it." Dr. Velrax pulsed with alarm. "Explain." Ethan gestured toward the shifting symbols. "It's a self-modifying equation, like the math problems Zilvar threw at me, but in real time, embedded into the very fabric of space." He narrowed his eyes. "And it's not stable." Jorek stiffened. "Meaning?" "Meaning it's going to collapse. Soon." The air cracked as a sudden wave of energy rippled outward, knocking them all off their feet. Ethan barely caught himself, digging his fingers into the stone. The rift pulsed violently, expanding and contracting in erratic bursts. "Options?" Jorek shouted over the roar of energy. Ethan's mind raced. The logic was clear, this was just another impossible problem, but now with real consequences. If he couldn't solve it, this entire sector could be swallowed by an uncontrolled spatial event. He analyzed the shifting symbols, his brain working in overdrive. Then, he saw it. The pattern. This thing is trying to stabilize itself, but it's trapped in a recursive loop, just like that paradox equation. He turned to Dr. Velrax. "If we introduce a controlled variable, something to break the cycle, we might force it into a stable state." Dr. Velrax pulsed thoughtfully. "What do you propose?" Ethan exhaled. "A manual reset." He yanked a data module from his suit and plugged it into the construct. His fingers flew over the interface, inputting a counter-equation, one designed to disrupt the self-referencing loop. The symbols on the structure flashed, twisting in response. "Come on," he muttered, adjusting the parameters. "Work with me here." The rift shrank, its violent surges slowing. The ground stopped trembling. Then, a final pulse of energy erupted outward, and the rift collapsed inward, leaving behind only silence. Jorek exhaled. "Did we just win?" Ethan stood up slowly, brushing dust from his suit. "Yeah. I think we did." Dr. Velrax's lattice pulsed in admiration. "Remarkable." Zilvar's voice crackled through the comms. "Well, it appears humanity has proven itself." Ethan smirked. "Took you long enough to admit it." For the first time, Zilvar had no snide remark. Ethan grinned. "All right, team. Let's go home."